Rosalie Mercer slammed the coin down on her mother's kitchen table so hard the jar rattled. $43, she said. That's what we have. That's what stands between us and Horace Bell walking through that door with a deed transfer and a smile. Abigail didn't move. The debt is $420, her mother said quietly. I know what the debt is, Mama. Then you know $43 is not $420. Rosalie picked up her leather apron off the chair. She tied it without looking down. Not yet, she said. But it will be. If this story just grabbed you, please subscribe to our channel. Hit that notification bell so you never miss what we put out. And drop a comment right now, telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Stay with us all the way to the end. Because what this woman builds with nothing but other people's garbage is going to leave you speechless. The laughter started before Rosalie even reached the scrap pile. She heard it the way she always heard it, not all at once, but in pieces. First a low comment she wasn't supposed to catch. Then a pause. Then the kind of laughter that meant the first man had said something the second man found funnier than expected. And now they were both looking at her back and deciding how far to push it. She kept walking. Jonas Pike's scrap pile sat behind his smithing shop at the south end of Dry Creek's Main Street. And it was exactly what it sounded like, a heap of discarded iron that Jonas had decided wasn't worth the coal it would take to work it. Bent horseshoes, cracked brackets, chain with failed links. Gate hardware so corroded it had turned the color of old brick. Plow iron that had snapped at the stress point and been thrown here because buying new was cheaper than fixing old. Rosalie stepped into the pile and started loading. Lord Almighty. The voice belonged to a cattle hand named Denton, who was leaning against the post outside the feed store with two of his companions. She knew it was Denton because she had learned to identify them all by voice. The way you learned to identify weather by sound before you could see it coming. You loading that wagon, or is the wagon loading you? Rosie? The two men beside him laughed. Rosalie picked up a horseshoe. Careful now, Denton continued, warming to his audience. That axle's already working hard enough. She put the horseshoe in the wagon. Here was what she had learned about moments like this one. You had approximately 3 seconds between hearing it and responding to it. And what you did in those 3 seconds determined everything. If you turned around, you gave them a face to perform for. If you answered back, you gave them a conversation to win. If you flinched, they filed it away for later. So she had developed a third option over the course of 26 years, which was to go somewhere inside herself that was quieter than the street, and wait there until the moment passed, and keep her hands moving. She picked up another horseshoe, and another, and another. She had 47 pieces by the time she climbed onto the wagon seat. Horseshoes mostly, some bent chain, 3 sections of corroded gate hardware, 2 snapped wheel brackets, 1 long strip of plow iron cracked straight down the center. Every piece of it had been thrown away. Every piece of it had been looked at by someone who knew iron, weighed against the cost of effort, and abandoned. She understood that feeling from both sides. Jonas Pike came out of his shop just as she was pulling the reins. He stood with his arms crossed and his gray beard tucked against his chest, looking at what she'd loaded with the expression of a man trying to work out whether he'd been robbed of something valuable or saved from hauling it himself. You want any of that? Rosalie asked. If I wanted it. It wouldn't be in the pile, he said. Then I'll take it, he grunted. Suit yourself, saves me a trip. He paused. What are you planning to do with it? Rosalie looked at him steadily. Work. He squinted at her, the way men in Dry Creek tended to squint at things they didn't know what to make of, not hostile. Exactly, but not welcoming either. Somewhere in the territory between the two where most of her life had been conducted. You know anything about iron? He asked. Some, she said. My grandfather taught me. Walt Mercer's. Sir, he was quiet for a moment. Something moved across his face, not quite respect. Not quite dismissal. He nodded once, turned around, and went back inside without another word. Rosalie drove the wagon home. 3 miles east of Dry Creek, the Mercer Ranch sat on land her father had broken and fenced before she was born. Not large, not prosperous, but theirs. Daniel Mercer had loved it the way men love things they have paid for in years rather than money. And when he died 4 years ago, he had left it to Abigail with the quiet faith that his wife and daughter would find a way to hold it. He had not lived to see the drought. He had not lived to see cattle prices collapse. He had not lived to see Horace Bell. Rosalie unhitched the wagon beside the old barn, her grandfather's barn. Walt Mercer's smithing barn, unused for 11 years, since the old man died and left his tools to gather dust and his knowledge to disappear from the family entirely. Or so everyone had assumed. She began unloading Horseshoes. Abigail came out of the house with flour on her hands and worry in her eyes, which was more or less the permanent condition of the past 8 months. "How many today?" her mother asked. 47 pieces. Abigail looked at the pile growing along the barn wall. "Rosie, I need you to talk to me straight, because Horace Bell was here this morning." Rosalie's hand stopped. "He sat in my kitchen," Abigail continued, and her voice was very controlled, which meant she was more frightened than she was letting show. "He drank my coffee, and he told me he understood our situation, and he wanted to help before things got worse. He was very polite about it. He's always polite. He raised his offer." "By how much?" Abigail told her. Rosalie set down the horseshoe she was holding. She turned to face her mother fully. "And what did you tell him?" "I told him I needed to speak with my daughter." "Then here is what your daughter says." She kept her voice quiet, because quiet carried further than loud when it mattered. "We are not selling to Horace Bell, not at that number. Not at any number if I can help it." Abigail pressed her lips together. "The debt is $420, Rosie. The cattle won't reach it. We have 43. "I know what we have." "Then help me understand how you get from 43 to 420 by the end of summer." Rosalie was quiet for a moment. Not because she didn't have an answer, but because the answer wasn't ready to be spoken yet. It was still something she was building, in more ways than one, and half-formed answers had a way of sounding like excuses. "Come to the barn tonight," she said. "After supper." Abigail searched her face. Then she nodded once, the way she nodded when she had decided to trust something she wasn't entirely sure deserved trusting. And she went back inside. Rosalie picked up the horseshoe. She carried it into the barn. Her grandfather's anvil was still in the center of the space where Walt Mercer had left it. And looking at it still did something complicated to her chest that she had never quite found words for. He had been 63 years old when he first put her hands on a piece of iron. She was 12, and he had stood behind her with his arms framing hers and said, in the particular flat, patient voice he used when he was teaching something he considered important, "Don't fight it, girl. Iron doesn't respond to fighting. You got to understand what it wants to be, and then you help it get there," she had said, with the absolute confidence of a 12-year-old. "Iron doesn't want anything. It's iron." And he had laughed, actually laughed, which he didn't do often, and said, "You keep thinking that. You'll learn." She had learned. She just hadn't had occasion to use it for 11 years. Until 8 weeks ago, when Horace Bell made his first offer on the property, and something in Rosalie Mercer's mind had gone very quiet and very clear. The way the air goes still before weather arrives. And she had walked into this barn and looked at her grandfather's tools and thought, "Not yet. Not while I can still swing a hammer." It had taken her 3 evenings to get the forge operational. The bellows needed new leather. She cut it from a boot she found in the corner. The chimney needed clearing. That took 2 hours and left her face black with soot. The coal supply needed replenishing, which meant a trip to town she wasn't looking forward to. She went anyway. She walked into the supply store, asked for coal, set the exact coins on the counter, and watched the man behind it, Frank Hurley, who had known her since she was 6 years old, do that particular pause. the half-second hesitation before he processed the request, where she could see him looking at her and running some kind of internal calculation that had nothing to do with whether her money was good. "That's a lot of coal for a ranch kitchen," Frank said. "It's not for the kitchen," Rosalie said. She loaded the bags herself. She drove home. She didn't look back. The first evening she lit the forge. She burned her first piece completely. She stood looking at the ruined iron with her hammer in her hand and her grandfather's voice in her head, "Don't fight it," and she breathed out slowly and reached for another horseshoe. The second evening she produced something shaped, approximately like her intention, but rough in a way that told her she'd rushed the temperature. She set it on the bench and looked at it for a long time. "Too fast," she said out loud to no one. Her grandfather would have agreed. The third evening she stopped rushing. She worked with the fire instead of against it. The way Walt had tried to explain when she was 12, and she had understood intellectually, without understanding in her hands. Now she understood in her hands. She felt when the iron was ready rather than judging by time. And when she finally struck the piece, it moved, the way iron was supposed to move, with resistance that was honest rather than stubborn, yielding at exactly the right moment. By the time the fire burned low, she was holding a horseshoe wall hook shaped like a horse's head. The neck arched. The nail points were even. The curves were clean. She held it up and turned it in the light from the dying fire. "There you are," she said quietly. She set it on the bench. Then she started on the next piece. By the time Abigail opened the barn door that night, there were 15 pieces laid out along the back wall. The horseshoe hooks, 2 boot scrapers, a firewood holder made from straightened chain links, reassembled into something that was sturdy and almost graceful. A trivet built from 3 bent shoes reshaped until they nested together flat and true. A set of tack hooks, a small iron sign that read Mer. The letters punched into a flattened strip of plow iron in clean, even strokes. Abigail stopped just inside the door. She didn't speak. She walked slowly along the bench, holding her lamp up to each piece, the way you hold a lamp up to something you need to look at twice before you believe it. She picked up the firewood holder. She tested its weight. She set it down. She picked up the Mercer sign. She ran her thumb along the raised letters. Slowly, all the way across. Then she stood with it in both hands and her back to Rosalie and didn't say anything for long enough that Rosalie began to feel the silence like a held breath. "Mama." Rosalie waited. Abigail set the sign down carefully. She turned around. Her eyes were dry, but the effort of keeping them that way was visible. "Your grandfather," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am. He taught you all of this. He taught me enough. The rest I've been working out." Abigail looked at the bench again. "How long have you been in here?" "Seriously?" "About 3 weeks, and before that." "How long were you planning it?" Rosalie met her eyes. "Since the first time Belle came to the property, 8 months ago." Abigail absorbed that. Something shifted in her face, not quite anger at the secrecy. Not quite relief. Some combination that Rosalie couldn't fully read. "What are you planning to sell these for?" Abigail asked. "Fair price. What the work is worth. And you believe people in this town will buy iron goods from?" She paused. "From a woman who looks like me," Rosalie said, without bitterness. Just plainly. I was going to say from someone with no established shop and no name in the trade. Some won't. But some will, because good iron is good iron, and eventually that matters more than who made it. Rosalie crossed her arms. "Jonas Pike is the only working smith within 20 miles, and his hands are going stiff. Everyone knows it. People need tack hardware, gate hooks, household iron. There's work here, Mama. Real work. Is there $420 worth of work?" The question sat between them. "There will be," Rosalie said. Abigail was quiet for a long moment. Then she set her lamp on the bench, reached out, and straightened the Mercer sign so it was exactly parallel to the edge of the wood. "Then you'd better get back to it," she said, and she walked out. Rosalie turned back to the forge. She built the fire up again, and the warmth of it pressed against her face and her hands and the front of her leather apron. And she picked up the next horseshoe from the pile. And she thought about her grandfather, and she thought about $420. And she thought about Horace Bell's polite, careful smile. And she put the iron in the fire. Clang. The first piece she sold was the trivet. Margaret Holt came into Tom Greer's general store on a Tuesday and saw it sitting on the counter where Rosalie had left it on consignment. She picked it up without asking what it was. She turned it upside down and pressed her palm flat against the surface to test whether it sat level. She set it right side up and pressed on each of the 3 shoes to see if any of them flexed. "Who made this?" Tom hesitated. "Rosalie Mercer," he said, in the tone of a man who wasn't sure how the information would land. Margaret looked at the trivet again. The Mercer girl? Walt's granddaughter? The same. Margaret set it down, opened her purse, and counted out the asking price without a word. She tucked the trivet under her arm and walked out. Tom slid the coins across the counter when Rosalie came in 2 days later, and she counted them into her palm without letting her expression change. And she said thank you, and she walked back out to the street. She made it a full mile down the road before she let herself breathe. $1.60. It was not $420. It was not even close, but it was proof small specific, irrefutable that someone had held her work in their hands and decided it was worth paying for. Not out of pity, not out of charity, because they looked at the things she had made from iron other people had thrown away, and they had decided, yes, this is worth something. She was back in the barn before dark. "You sold something," Abigail said at supper, because she had a mother's ability to read facts from her daughter's face before her daughter volunteered them. "The trivet," Rosalie told her. Abigail nodded. "That's a start. It's proof," Rosalie said. "There's a difference." Her mother looked at her. "Is there? A start means you're guessing it might work. Proof means you know the direction is right." She set down her fork. "The direction is right, Mama." Abigail picked up her coffee cup. "Then keep going," she said. The tack hooks sold in 4 days. Cartwright from the livery sent word he wanted to talk about hardware for his tack room. A woman flagged her wagon down on the road and asked if she was the one making the iron pieces, and could she repair a garden gate hinge. "I can," Rosalie said. "What will you charge?" Rosalie named a fair number. The woman said Jonas Pike would have charged me more and taken twice as long. "I know," Rosalie said. "That's why I said that number." The woman laughed genuinely, not meanly, and told her she'd bring the hinge by Thursday. Coins accumulated in the kitchen jar. Slowly, the math every night was the same stubborn shape progress that was real. A gap that was still enormous. She needed something larger. Something that would make people understand all at once, without explanation, what she was capable of. She had started thinking about it the night she made the Mercer sign. The idea had come in pieces, the way Walt always said the best ideas came, assembling itself quietly in the back of her mind while her hands were occupied with other work. Until one evening she looked up from the bench and realized she had been thinking about it for weeks without fully admitting it to herself. She had started on it 10 days ago, late at night, after the sellable pieces were done, and the fire was still hot, and she had a few hours, and the horseshoes that were too damaged for hooks but too interesting for waste. She wasn't making decoration. She wasn't making household goods. She was building something she couldn't yet name out loud, because giving it a name would make it real. And making it real would mean it could fail, and she was not ready to hold that possibility directly yet. She locked the barn door every night when she left. Caleb Rourke walked through her unlocked barn door on a Wednesday morning in late June, and Rosalie heard the light change before she heard his boots. She turned around. She had seen him in town. You didn't miss Caleb Rourke. because he moved through space with the particular steadiness of a man who was used to things going wrong and had decided not to be alarmed by it anymore. Dark hair, dark eyes, the build of a man who worked beside his hands rather than above them. His hat was pushed back, and he was holding a piece of hardware she recognized as a specialized swivel bracket for high-tension tie rings, the kind you needed when you were dealing with horses that pulled hard and cheap iron wasn't going to hold. It had fractured cleanly at the joint. She didn't say anything. He said, "Pike sent me." "I know why you're here," Rosalie said. "Let me see it." He held it out and she took it, and she turned it in her hands the way she turned everything in her hands, not performing examination, but actually doing it. Feeling the weight distribution, finding the fracture point with her thumb, tracing the taper where the two metal thicknesses met. There. That was the problem. The taper was too abrupt. Stress concentrated instead of distributing, and eventually the joint gave way. Not a bad piece of work. Overall, just one design decision made wrong. And everything else in the piece had paid for it. She looked at it for a while. Caleb waited. He didn't fill the silence. She noticed that. "I can't repair this," she said. He nodded, accepting it. "But I can make you a better one." He stopped nodding. "The flaw isn't in the iron," she said. "It's in the taper at the joint. Too sharp. Fix that, add a 1/4 inch to the shank. And the stress distributes instead of concentrating." She handed it back. "The piece I make you will look different than this one. But it won't break at the joint." Caleb turned the broken bracket over in his hands. Then he looked at her not the way most men in Dry Creek looked at her, which was with some combination of pity and amusement, and the particular blankness of men who have already decided what a person is before she opens her mouth. He looked at her the way he had looked at the broken bracket, like someone assessing a thing for what it actually was. "How long?" he asked. "How much?" She named her price. He didn't flinch, didn't negotiate. He put out his hand and she shook it, a real handshake. The kind that meant something, and he said, 3 days. Then in turned to go. "Mr. Rourke," she said. He looked back. "May I ask what made you come here instead of waiting for Pike's hands to improve?" He considered the question as if it deserved consideration. "Because Cartwright told me you repaired his tack room brackets, and they were the cleanest welds he'd seen in 5 years. He settled his hat. "A man who'd rather be right than fast told me that. I don't ignore information like that." He left. Rosalie stood in the middle of the barn with the memory of a fair handshake and held it there for a moment, examining it the way she examined everything for what it actually was, not for what she wanted it to be. Then she went back to work. The bracket was ready in 3 days. Caleb came back and picked it up and examined it the way she expected him to, seriously, methodically, pressing the joint, testing the swivel action, looking at the taper with his head tilted and his eyes narrow. "Clean," he said. "Thank you, better than clean." He set it down and paid her the exact amount quoted. "I've got 2 more that need replacing. Same design flaw. Can you do them both?" "Yes. I'll bring them Thursday." He picked up his hat from the bench where he'd set it. "You mind me asking what else you're working on?" Rosalie glanced toward the far corner of the barn, where the locked section was, where the other thing lived in pieces and firelight, and the secret architecture of a plan she hadn't told anyone about yet. "Ironwork," she said. "That right." The corner of his mouth moved slightly. Not quite a smile, the precursor to one, maybe, if circumstances warranted. "Well, Thursday then, Miss Mercer." "Thursday, Mr. Rourke." He left and she stood listening to his boots cross the yard. And when the sound faded, she allowed herself exactly 3 seconds of something that wasn't quite happiness, but was adjacent to it, the feeling of being seen accurately, which she had not experienced often enough to take lightly. Then she tied her apron tighter and went back to the locked corner. Horace Bell arrived the following Thursday morning in his good buggy behind his well-fed horse. And he arrived at the worst possible time, which Rosalie suspected was not an accident. She was in the yard when he pulled up, coming out of the barn with iron dust on her apron and her hair escaping its bun in 4 directions. And Belle stepped down from the buggy, looking clean and unhurried and arranged. The way a man looks when he has had all morning to prepare for a conversation he expects to win. "Miss Mercer," he said pleasantly. "And is your mother about?" "She is," Rosalie said. "What can we do for you, Mr. Bell?" Abigail came out onto the porch with her hands folded in front of her apron, which meant she had heard the buggy and had positioned herself before she came out, which meant she was prepared. Bell removed his hat and inclined his head toward Abigail with the smooth respect of a man who knew exactly how to calibrate deference toward widows. "Mrs. Mercer, I appreciate you seeing me." He turned to include both of them. "I'll be plain with you. I've raised my offer. Given current conditions and the timeline you're facing, I believe what I'm prepared to put on the table is more than generous." He named the number. It was more than Rosalie had expected. It was not enough. "Mr. Bell," Rosalie said, "the land is worth more than that. In a different market, perhaps." And no. Her voice was quiet and flat, and she looked him directly in the eye. "We're not selling." Bell looked at her steadily. Then he turned toward Abigail with the particular recognition of a man who has learned that the daughter is the hard obstacle and is trying the mother instead. "Mrs. Mercer, I understand your daughter's optimism, and I respect it. But the practical reality of your position—" "My daughter speaks for both of us," Abigail said, from the porch, in a voice that had exactly nothing yielding in it. Bell absorbed this. He turned back to Rosalie, and something shifted at the edge of his expression, still polite, still controlled, but sharpened now, the pleasantness thinned to show something harder underneath. "You think Horseshoes are going to save a ranch," he said. "No, sir," Rosalie said. She held his gaze without moving. "But what I'm building with them might." Belle's eyes went to the barn. She was standing in front of the door, and she hadn't positioned herself there by accident. And he was smart enough to understand that she hadn't. "And what exactly is it you're building, Miss Mercer?" "Something that isn't ready to be seen." He looked at her for a moment, taking her full measure. She understood, the way men like Bell did when they were deciding how seriously to weigh a variable they'd been discounting. Then he put his hat back on and settled it carefully. "I'll check back at summer's end," he said pleasantly. "You know where we are," Rosalie said. He drove away. Abigail came down off the porch and stood beside her daughter, and they both watched the buggy until it was gone. Then Abigail said, without turning her head, "What are you building in there?" "Rosie, I'll show you when it's done." "That's not an answer." "No, ma'am." Rosalie untied and reteed her apron, snugging it closer. "But it's what I've got right now." Abigail was quiet for a moment. "He's going to come back." "I know. And if you're wrong about this, I know." Her mother turned to look at her then. Really look at her, the way she had looked at her when she was 12 years old, and had told Walt Mercer that iron didn't want anything. And Walt had laughed. Abigail was not laughing, but there was something in her face that was close to the same thing. "Don't be wrong," her mother said. She went back inside. Rosalie stood alone in the yard, with the summer heat pressing down, and the deadline pressing harder, and $43 in a kitchen jar, and something locked in a barn that the whole town had already decided was worthless. She walked back inside, she put on her apron, she built up the fire. And in Dry Creek, as the summer deepened and the evenings grew hot and airless, people going about their business noticed that the sound coming from the old Mercer barn had changed. It wasn't the irregular sound of someone tinkering. It wasn't the hesitant rhythm of someone learning. It was deliberate. It was patient. It was the sound of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Clang. Pause clang. And 3 miles down the road, behind a locked barn door, with 8 weeks and $43, and the weight of her family's land on her shoulders, Rosalie Mercer worked through the night because the iron wasn't ready yet. And neither was she, and neither was the thing she was building that nobody had seen and nobody could stop, and nobody in Dry Creek had the first idea was coming. Caleb Rourke came back on Thursday with the 2 broken brackets. Same as he'd promised, and he came back on Friday with something nobody had asked him to bring. Word. Cartwright's been talking, he said, setting the brackets on Rosalie's bench without preamble. Told 3 ranchers about your tack room work. 2 of them asked me this morning if I knew how to find you. Rosalie turned a bracket over in her hands without looking up. What did you tell them? I told them east of town. 3 miles, look for the barn with the fire in it. He paused. I hope that's all right. That's fine. They'll come by the end of the week. Probably. He watched her fingers move along the fracture point in the metal. You already know what's wrong with it, don't you? You knew before I finished setting it down. Same flaw as the first one, she said. Different location. Joint tapers too aggressive. She set it beside the second one and compared them. Whoever made these was consistent, at least. Wrong the same way every time. Caleb almost smiled. Is that a compliment? It's an observation. She straightened up. Come back Monday, they'll be ready. He picked up his hat. Then he didn't leave immediately, which she noticed because men like Caleb Rourke, in her experience, did not linger without reason. Miss Mercer, he said. Can I ask you something direct? You can ask. How much time do you have? She looked at him. Before what? Before Bell gets what he came for. The directness of it landed without softening. And she found she didn't mind. Directness was its own kind of respect. 8 weeks, she said now. Caleb nodded slowly. He turned his hat in his hands once, the way a man turns something over when he's choosing his words carefully. Then you'd better let those 2 ranchers find you. He settled his hat and moved toward the door. Monday then. Monday, she said. He left. She stood for a moment looking at the 2 broken brackets on her bench. Then she looked at the locked section of the barn. Then she picked up her hammer and went back to work on both. The first rancher who came was named Aldous Webb, 50 years old. Sunburned to a permanent terracotta, with the specific impatience of a man who had driven 3 miles out of his way and was already calculating whether it was worth it before he stepped through the door. He looked at Rosalie. He looked at her size. She watched him do it. The quick involuntary inventory that men performed without realizing she could see them performing it, and then he looked at the pieces on the bench. And she watched that register differently. You made those, he said. Yes, sir. He walked to the bench and picked up a tack hook. He tried to flex it. It didn't flex. He tried the weld at the base. Solid. He set it down and picked up a gate bracket she'd finished 2 days ago and ran his thumb along the join. How much for 6 of these? He pointed at the brackets. She named her price. She didn't move. He looked at her. That's firm? That's fair, she said. Jonas Pike would charge you more. Pike's in town. You're 3 miles out. Then the ride cost you time, Rosalie said. The bracket cost you less. You come out ahead. She held his gaze without blinking. And mine won't fail at the joint. Aldous Webb looked at her for a long moment. Then he put out a calloused hand. 2 weeks? 10 days, she said. She shook it. He left satisfied, which she could tell, because he walked faster going out than he had coming in. Satisfied men moved with purpose. Men who felt they'd lost something moved carefully. Like they were protecting what was left. She wrote his name in her ledger. $43 in the jar. 6 bracket order from Webb. 2 brackets for Rourke. 3 tack hooks for Cartwright's second stable. She did the arithmetic. Still not enough. Not close enough. But the shape of the number was changing less like a wall and more like a distance. And distances could be covered if you kept moving. She went back to the locked section of the barn. What lived there was still in pieces. Still in the architecture stage. Still something only she fully understood the shape of. She had made a decision 2 nights ago about the scale of it. And the decision had frightened her a little, which she took as a sign that it was probably right. Small things didn't frighten you. Only the things that were large enough to matter if they failed. She picked up a horseshoe and put it in the fire. The second rancher came the following morning. His name was Garrett, younger than Webb, with a more open face and a wife who had apparently described exactly what she wanted in a set of kitchen hooks and sent her husband out with a list, written in a very small, very precise handwriting, that Garrett presented to Rosalie with the expression of a man who understood he was acting as a messenger and was comfortable with that role. Rosalie read the list. "She knows what she wants," Rosalie said. "She always does," Garrett said in the fond tone of a man who considered this a feature rather than a problem. "Tell her I can do all of it." 2 weeks. Garrett tucked the list away. He looked around the barn at the pieces on the bench. The way people always looked when they first came in, with that particular recalibration happening behind their eyes when reality didn't match expectation. "My wife also wanted me to ask if you'd be willing to take a larger commission." Rosalie went still. "What kind of commission?" "She saw what you did to the Holt Gate hinge." Margaret Holt told half the women in Dry Creek about it. He scratched the back of his neck. "Clara wants to know if you could make decorative iron pieces for the house. Wall pieces. Something that she said something that looked like it meant something." Rosalie looked at the bench. She thought about the locked section. She thought of about 7 weeks. "Tell her yes," Rosalie said, "and tell her to come see me herself. I want to know what it means to her before I decide what to make." Garrett blinked. Clearly, he had not expected that answer. "All right," he said slowly. "I'll tell her." Rosalie turned back to her fire. Clara Garrett arrived the next morning on her own, without her husband, which Rosalie respected immediately. She was 40 years old with quick eyes and the manner of a woman who had formed opinions about most things and was interested in revising them when presented with sufficient evidence. She walked through the barn door, looked at the pieces on the bench, and said, "Margaret Holt told me you made something beautiful out of nothing." "I made something useful out of discarded iron," Rosalie said. "Same thing, sometimes." Clara moved along the bench without touching anything yet. "Just looking. My husband said you wanted to know what I wanted it to mean. I did. Why does that matter? Because a piece of iron on a wall can look like many things," Rosalie said. "But it only feels like something if it's right for the person living with it. If I'm going to make you something that lasts, I need to know what you're trying to hold on to." Clara stopped walking. She turned around and looked at Rosalie with an expression that had shifted from assessment into something more open. "My mother came to Colorado from Tennessee," she said. "She brought 3 things with her: a quilt, a Bible, and an iron trivet her grandmother made." She paused. "The trivet is the only one left." Rosalie didn't say anything. "I want something that feels like that," Clara said. "Like it came from somewhere, and it's going somewhere. Like it means the family." Rosalie nodded once. "I can do that. How much?" Rosalie named a number that was higher than her usual pieces. It was the right number for the work she was describing. Clara didn't negotiate. When 3 weeks, Clara Garrett shook her hand and left. And Rosalie stood in the barn with a commission in her ledger and something warm and complicated in her chest that she identified, after a moment, as the specific satisfaction of being understood. She put it in her pocket alongside the other small victories and went back to work. The jar on the kitchen counter had $91 in it by the 3rd week of July. Rosalie counted it on a Tuesday evening, with Abigail sitting across the table, both of them looking at the coins and the few bills with a particular expression of people doing arithmetic that is coming out right in direction, but wrong in magnitude. 91, Abigail said. "Yes, we need 420. "I'm aware." "Mama, you have 6 weeks, 5.5. Rosalie stacked the coins back into the jar. "I know the numbers." Abigail folded her hands on the table. "I'm not trying to discourage you. I know that too. I just want us both to be looking at the same thing." Rosalie looked at her mother across the table. Abigail Mercer had aged in the 4 years since Daniel died. Not dramatically, but honestly, the way grief aged people who were too practical to let it stop them. It showed in the lines around her mouth, and the gray that had spread through her hair, and the way she held her shoulders now. with a constant low-level bracing against the next thing. She was 52 years old, and she looked like a woman who had been carrying something heavy for a long time without putting it down. "Mama," Rosalie said quietly, "let me show you something." Abigail looked up. "Come to the barn. You said it wasn't ready." "It isn't finished," Rosalie said. "But I think you need to see where it's going." Abigail followed her across the yard without speaking. And Rosalie unlocked the barn and pushed the big doors open and stepped aside. Abigail walked in. She stopped. On the floor and against the far wall, in peace, in progress, in a state that required imagination to fully understand, was the beginning of something that was clearly going to be extraordinary. Hundreds of horseshoes laid out in careful groupings by size and curve. Lengths of chain sorted and labeled with chalk marks on the floor. Gate hardware in the early stages of assembly, and at the center, already taking shape in a way that made the intention unmistakable, the curved arch of an entrance gate. 8 feet tall, and at its center the beginning of a horse. Not a decorative horse, not a suggestion of a horse. A horse mid-motion, forged from horseshoes, each one positioned to follow the curve of muscle and bone. The whole thing caught in the moment of breaking forward, and the power of it was already visible even in the early stage. Already present in the angle of the neck and the set of the forelegs. Abigail stood looking at it for a very long time. "Rosie," she finally said, "it's not done. I can see what it's going to be. That's why I wanted you to see it now." Rosalie moved to stand beside central section. "When it's finished, it'll be an entrance gate. Full arch. 8 feet at the center, the horse coming through the middle. Around it, the valley. Cattle, mountains, wheat, wagon wheels." She paused. "Every piece of iron in it is from somebody's scrap pile. Every piece was thrown away." Abigail turned to look at her daughter. "This is what you were building," she said. "All along." "This is what I was building," Rosalie said. "All along." And Abigail stopped, started again. "You think this will bring in enough?" "I think this will make people understand what I can do. And when they understand that, the orders will follow." She looked at the gate. "Caleb Rourke told me the other day that if people saw the gate, they'd line up to commission one for their own ranch. He said he'd put in the first order himself. At fair price?" "Exactly fair price. Nothing more, nothing less." She paused. "He's that kind of man." Abigail looked at her daughter for a moment with an expression Rosalie couldn't fully parse. Then she looked back at the gate. "How long until it's finished?" 5 weeks. "If nothing goes wrong." "And if something." Rosalie was quiet. "Then I'll fix it," she said. Abigail nodded slowly. She reached out and touched one of the horseshoes, at the base of the arch one that Rosalie had cleaned and straightened and reshaped from the rusted bent scrap she'd pulled from Jonas Pike's pile on the day. 2 men had laughed at her from across the street. "Your grandfather would have loved this," Abigail said softly. Rosalie didn't answer right away. She looked at the horseshoe under her mother's hand and thought about Walt Mercer and his particular flat, patient voice and the way he had stood behind her with his arms framing hers and told her not to fight the iron. "I know," she said. Abigail withdrew her hand. She straightened her apron. She was Abigail Mercer again, practical, forward-facing. The grief folded back into its proper place. "Then finish it," she said. And she walked back to the house. Rosalie locked the barn behind her and went back inside to work. Jonas Pike came to find her on a Wednesday. She heard his boots on the yard before she heard the knock. And she opened the barn door to find him standing there with his arms crossed and his jaw set in the expression of a man who has made a decision he's not entirely comfortable with, but intends to commit to me. "I heard you turned down 2 repair jobs last week," he said. Without preamble. "I did," she said. "I'm at capacity right now. Turned down Hendricks. His hinge repair needed 3 days I don't have. He came to me." Jonas shifted. "My hands handled it all right. But there'll be more." He looked at her steadily. "I'm thinking about sending my overflow your way. Formally. You'd take the jobs I can't manage well anymore. Do the work. Keep the profit. Rosalie looked at him. This was not a small thing Jonas Pike was saying. This was a man who had been the only smith in 20 miles for 30 years, standing at her barn door, and admitting that his hands were failing, and he had decided she was the person to carry what he was putting down. "Why me?" she asked. "Because you're good," he said. As if the answer was so obvious, the question had been slightly insulting. "And because Walt Mercer taught you, and Walt Mercer never taught anything to anybody who wasn't worth teaching." He paused. "And because I'd rather the work stay good than stay with a name." Rosalie was quiet for a moment. "I'll need capacity," she said. "I'm finishing something right now that has to come first." "What are you finishing?" She considered him. Jonas Pike had known her grandfather. He had 30 years of iron in his hands. And he was standing at her barn door at 61 years old, with his pride folded up small enough to fit through the opening. "Come in," she said. He came in. He looked at the gate the same way Abigail had, with the long silence of someone taking in something larger than they'd anticipated. He walked around it slowly. He crouched at the base and looked at the join between two horseshoes in the horse's shoulder. And she watched his eyes move, the way a smith's eyes move when they're reading workmanship rather than just looking at it. He stood back up. "That's the Mercer Ranch arch," he said. "Yes, you're putting it up on the road, where everyone driving into Dry Creek will see it." She crossed her arms. "It'll be my sign, my advertisement. If people want to know what I can do." They drive past the gate. Jonas looked at it for another moment. Then he said, with the flatness of a man paying a compliment he didn't intend to repeat often, "Your grandfather would have been satisfied." Coming from Jonas Pike, satisfied was as close to extraordinary as language got. "Thank you," Rosalie said. "I'll take your overflow." He nodded. He looked at the gate one more time. Then he left without saying anything else. Because men like Jonas Pike believed that what needed saying had been said. Rosalie turned back to the gate 5 weeks, 4 weeks. She worked. The problem arrived on a Tuesday evening in the 4th week, and it arrived without warning the way the worst problems always did. She heard it before she saw it, a deep metallic groan that was wrong in a way her body registered before her mind caught up, and then the central support section of the gate shifted. And she was moving before the thought was fully formed. Crossing the barn in 4 steps and getting her shoulder under the arch before the whole left side came down. But it was too heavy, it was too much, and she managed to slow it rather than stop it, and the section came down anyway. Heavily, striking the floor and sending horseshoes scattering across the barn in every direction. She stood in the dust with her shoulder aching and her heart going hard and fast, and looked at what was on the floor. The arch had held. The horse had held. But the left gate panel, 43 horseshoes she had spent 11 days placing in precise sequence to represent the mountain line of the valley, had separated from its supporting brace at the weld point and come down flat. And several of the horseshoes had shifted, and 3 had come completely free. She stood there looking at it. 11 days, 43 shoes. 4.5 weeks to the deadline. She crouched down and picked up one of the loose horseshoes and turned it in her hands and felt the full weight of the moment settle onto her shoulders, not just the broken panel, but everything behind it. The debt. The jar with $112. Belle's face when he told her he'd check back at summer's end. The 2 men outside the feed store. Denton's voice carrying across the street. Every person who had looked at her and decided, before she opened her mouth, before she picked up a hammer, before she did anything at all, that she was not capable of this. She sat down on the floor of the barn. She had not sat down on the floor of the barn before. There had not been time. She sat there for a while. Then she heard the barn door open, and she looked up. And Caleb Rourke was standing in the doorway with the 2 brackets she'd told him were ready, and an expression that changed when he saw what was on the floor. He came in without asking permission. He looked at the fallen panel. He looked at the weld point that had failed. He crouched down and examined it. And she watched him turn the problem over the same way she had turned the bracket systematically. Without drama, reading the actual failure rather than reacting to the fact of it. Brace gave at the weld, he said. I know, you heated the support piece too fast, he said. Cold iron underneath a hot surface. It looked solid and it wasn't. She looked at him. He was right. She had been rushing that section because she was behind on time, and she had known when she did it that she was rushing, and she had told herself it was fine, and it had not been fine. I know, she said. Caleb was quiet for a moment. He picked up one of the loose horseshoes and looked at it. Then he set it down carefully, precisely, in its original position on the floor. Can you fix it? How long? A week. Maybe less if the iron cooperates. You have the time? She did the math. Barely, if I work nights, she said. He nodded. He stood up. He was looking at the gate, not the fallen panel, but the whole thing. The arch, the horse, the sections that it held, the scale of the thing she had been building in secret while the town made jokes about her junk barn. This is larger than I thought, he said quietly. Yes. I mean, this is significantly larger than anything I imagined when you said you were building something. He paused. This isn't a ranch project, Miss Mercer. This is something people will travel to see. She said nothing. Caleb turned away from the gate and looked at her. Sitting on the floor of her barn with iron dust on her hands and her hair down around her shoulders, and the particular face of someone who has just watched weeks of work hit the floor. Let me help, he said. No. Her voice was not sharp. But it was absolutely clear. I appreciate it. Genuinely. But the moment someone else does my structural work, this stops being mine, and I need it to be mine, because when this gate goes up, people need to know exactly who made it, every weld, every piece of it. Caleb held her gaze. Then he nodded, slowly, the nod of a man who has understood something and intends to respect it. Then tell me what you need that isn't smithing, he said. She looked at him. Somebody to work the bellows while I weld, she said. After a moment, somebody to hold a brace in position when I need both hands for the iron. Somebody to move material. She paused. Somebody to keep the fire from dying when I'm on the other side of the barn. That's labor, he said. Yes, I can do labor. She looked at him for a long moment. Caleb Rourke, who owned a successful ranch and employed a dozen hands and could have written a check for her debt and solved this entire problem, and had never once suggested it, was standing in her barn asking if he could pump her bellows. Monday morning, she said. I'll be here before sunup, he said. That's soon enough. The corner of her mouth moved. It'll do, she said. He left. She sat on the floor of her barn for a little while longer. Then she stood up, because the floor was not where the work happened. And she picked up the fallen horseshoes, one by one, and laid them back in their positions on the ground, where she could see the shape of what she was rebuilding. And she thought about her grandfather and his flat, patient voice. And she thought about 4 weeks, and she thought about the specific satisfaction of a thing that was difficult in proportion to how much it mattered. Then she built up the fire. Clang, the work resumed. By the time Aldous Webb came back on Friday to check on his brackets, she had the panel half rebuilt and the brace re-welded correctly. Slowly, with the proper heat throughout, and Webb stood in the barn doorway and looked at the gate with the expression of a man encountering something he hadn't been prepared for. That's what you're building, he said. That's part of it, Rosalie said. Without stopping, he was quiet for a long moment. I want one, he said. She looked up. Want one what? An entrance gate. He pointed at the arch. Like that. For my property. Mr. Webb, I haven't finished this one, I know. I'm putting in a commission for after. He crossed his arms. Whatever you want to charge, I'll pay it. She looked at him steadily. Whatever I want to charge is fair price, Mr. Webb. Not more. He shrugged. Fair price then, but I want to be first. She opened her ledger and wrote his name. The jar on the kitchen counter held $138. 4 weeks to the deadline, Rosalie put on her apron. tied it tight, and went back to work. Caleb Rourke arrived before sunup on Monday the way he said he would. And he arrived alone, without announcement, without the particular fanfare of a man expecting to be thanked for showing up. He knocked once on the barn door, and when Rosalie opened it, he stepped inside. Looked at the half-rebuilt panel on the floor, looked at the fire she already had going, and said, "Where do you need me first?" That was all. No commentary on the hour, no observations about the gate. No performance of generosity designed to remind her that he was doing her a favor. Just the question, direct and practical, from a man who had shown up because he said he would and intended to be useful. "Bellows," she said. "I need steady heat for the next brace weld." "Even pressure, don't rush it." He moved to the bellows without another word. She put the iron in the fire. They worked for 3 hours before either of them said anything beyond the functional "more heat." "Hold that, pass me the hammer." It wasn't uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people focused on the same problem. And Rosalie had not experienced that particular kind of companionable quiet since her grandfather died. Since the last time she had stood at a forge with someone who understood what the work required and gave it what it required without being asked. The brace came out right. She held it up and turned it and ran her thumb along the weld and felt the difference from last time solid all the way through. The heat having penetrated evenly, no cold core underneath waiting to fail under pressure. "That's it," she said quietly. Caleb looked up from the bellows. "Good? Right," she said. There was a difference, and he heard it in her voice. He straightened up and rolled his shoulders, because 3 hours at the bellows was real work, regardless of how strong a man was, and said, "What next?" She showed him. By mid-morning they had the panel reassembled on the floor, each horseshoe back in its position along the mountain line of the valley. The sequence she had spent 11 days establishing restored. She crouched at the base and walked the length of it slowly, checking each placement, and Caleb crouched at the other end and did the same without being asked. And when they met in the middle, she said, 7 of them need adjusting. Show me which ones." She marked them with chalk. He held each one in position while she tack-welded it, his hands steady against the pull of the metal, not flinching when the heat got close. She noticed he didn't tell her where to weld. He didn't offer opinions on her placement. He held what she asked him to hold and let her do the thinking. When they broke at noon, Abigail came out with 2 plates of food and set them on the bench without comment, which Rosalie understood was her mother's version of approval. Abigail Mercer did not feed people she didn't trust. Caleb picked up his plate and said, to Abigail, "Thank you." "Ma'am, you're helping my daughter," Abigail said simply. "That's thanks enough." She went back inside. Caleb looked at Rosalie across the bench. "Your mother doesn't waste words." "No," Rosalie said. "She never has." He ate for a moment. Then, "Can I ask you something?" "You can ask. When did you know the gate was going to be the gate?" "The full thing, the arch, the horse, the valley panels." "When did you know that's what it was?" Rosalie thought about it honestly. "The night Bell made his first offer," she said. "I came out here and looked at my grandfather's anvil, and I thought I need something big enough that people can't look away from it. Something that makes them understand before I say a single word." She set her plate down. "A hook sells one customer. A gate sells every customer who drives past it for the next 50 years. Caleb was quiet for a moment. "That's not how most people think. Most people aren't trying to save a ranch with a scrap pile." He looked at her, the direct, assessing look she had noticed that first day, the one that had nothing dismissive in it. "No," he said. "They're not." They went back to work in the afternoon. By the time the light started failing, the panel was rebuilt, re-welded, and reattached to its supporting brace with the correct heat procedure. Slow and thorough, the iron warm all the way through before she struck it. She stood back and looked at the full gate assembly for the first time since the collapse. And it was larger than she had remembered, and more complete. and the horse at its center had a quality she couldn't entirely describe, something in the angle of the neck, the set of the forelegs, the way the horseshoes curved to follow the animal's actual musculature that made it feel alive in a way that surprised even her. Caleb stood beside her. Neither of them spoke for a moment. 3 weeks, she said. Maybe less. He looked at the horse. It's going to stop people, he said. I mean that literally. People driving past on that road are going to stop their wagons, because they won't be able to not. That's what I need it to do. It'll do it. He picked up his hat from the bench. Tomorrow if you can, I can. He moved toward the door. Then he stopped, and she thought he was going to say something significant. Something that matched the weight of the day, and instead he said, Your bellows leather is drying out on the left side. You'll want to treat it before the week's out, or it'll crack. She blinked. I'll do it tonight, good? He settled his hat and left. She stood in the barn for a long moment after he was gone. And the thing she felt was not the thing she had been careful not to feel. Or rather, it was exactly that thing, and she had run out of sufficient reason to call it something else. She folded it up neatly and put it in the same pocket where she kept the small victories. And she went back to the gate, and she worked until the fire burned low. The next twist came from a direction she hadn't anticipated. Tom Greer sent a boy out to the ranch on Wednesday morning with a folded note that said, Mrs. Fontaine at the hotel wants to talk to you. Today, if possible. Rosalie read it twice. Eleanor Fontaine owned the Dry Creek Hotel, which was the most substantial building in town and the gathering point for every rancher, cattle dealer, and traveling merchant who passed through the territory. Eleanor was 60 years old, French-born, had arrived in Colorado with her late husband 20 years ago, and built the hotel with her own money and her own decisions, and was widely understood to be the most commercially intelligent person in Dry Creek regardless of gender. She did not send for people casually. Rosalie took off her apron, put on her better dress, and drove to town. Eleanor Fontaine received her in the hotel's back office, which was small and orderly and contained a desk covered in papers that were clearly organized according to a system only Eleanor fully understood. Eleanor herself was a compact woman with silver hair and the particular composed expression of someone who had long since stopped being interested in what other people thought of her appearance. She did not offer pleasantries. I have heard about your gate, Eleanor said. The moment Rosalie sat down, Rosalie went still. It isn't finished, I know. Caleb Rourke described it to me. Eleanor folded her hands on the desk. He said it was the finest piece of frontier ironwork he had seen outside of a city foundry. He said he believed people would come specifically to see it. She paused. Caleb Rourke does not exaggerate. No, Rosalie agreed. He doesn't. I want to commission a piece for the hotel. Eleanor's eyes were direct and entirely serious. Something for the main entrance. Large. Something that tells people, when they walk through my door, that this establishment is permanent. That it was built to last. She paused. I want it made from Colorado iron. From this valley. Rosalie held her gaze. What you're describing is a significant commission. The timeline would put it after the ranch gate. Summer's end at the earliest. I can wait until fall, Eleanor said. But I want a commitment now, and I want to pay a deposit now. She named a number. Rosalie kept her face completely still. The deposit alone was more than the jar on the kitchen counter. I'll need to know more about what you're envisioning, Rosalie said. Because giving the right answer too quickly was its own kind of mistake. Of course, Eleanor said. That's why I asked you here today rather than sending a letter. She stood up. Come. I'll show you the entrance and tell you what I want it to feel like. You tell me what's possible. They spent an hour going through the details. When Rosalie drove home, she had a signed commission letter from Eleanor Fontaine folded in her pocket and a deposit that, combined with the kitchen jar, brought the total to $206. $206. She sat on the wagon seat with the reins loose in her hands and did the arithmetic, and the arithmetic was still not 420, but it was no longer laughable, and it was no longer impossible, and for the first time since this had started, she could see the shape of a path that actually reached the destination. She pushed the horse to a trot. Abigail was on the porch when she pulled up, and she read something in Rosalie's face before Rosalie said a word. And she stood up straighter. "Tell me," she said. Rosalie told her. Abigail sat back down in her porch chair slowly, the way people sit down when their legs decide before their mind does. 206, she said. In the jar. With the deposit. We still need 214 more. I know. Mama Abigail pressed her hands flat on her knees. In 3 weeks. 3 weeks and 2 days. Rosalie climbed down from the wagon. I have Webb's commission, Garrett's household pieces, Rourke's 2 gates from his east pasture, Pike's overflow repairs, and the Fontaine deposit, combined with what's in the jar. If the remaining commissions pay on delivery and I finish the ranch gate on time. She stopped. Is that an if or a when? Rosalie looked at her. It's a when. Abigail looked back at her for a long moment. Then she stood up and went inside and came back with 2 cups of coffee and handed one to Rosalie and sat back down. And they drank their coffee on the porch, in the evening air, without saying anything, which was its own kind of conversation. Horace Bell arrived the following morning. He did not come in his good buggy this time. He came on horseback, which meant he had decided on a different kind of call, less formal, more direct, the visit of a man who wanted to catch rather than impress. He rode into the yard while Rosalie was outside checking the bellows leather, and she straightened up and looked at him and said nothing while he dismounted. Miss Mercer, he said. I'll be brief, all right. I've been hearing things about your barn. He looked toward the barn. The doors were closed and latched. Things that make me think I may have underestimated your situation slightly. Slightly, Rosalie said. He looked at her and she watched him recalibrate, the pleasant mask adjusting over something harder underneath. I want to revise my offer one final time. The number I give you today will be the last number I put forward. After today, if the debt comes due and you can't cover it, the property reverts to the creditor, and I purchase it through that process, which won't be pleasant for your family and won't get you anything near what I'm prepared to offer right now. He named a number. It was higher than before. It was not $420 worth of dignity. Mr. Bell, Rosalie said, what you're offering is still less than this land is worth. And what I'm building is worth more than you know. She kept her voice even. We're not selling. Bell looked at her for a long moment. 3 weeks, Miss Mercer. 2 weeks and 5 days, she said. I'm counting too. He mounted his horse. He looked down at her from the saddle with an expression that was still controlled but had shed the last of its pleasantness. The careful performance finally thinned to nothing. You are a stubborn woman, he said. Yes, sir, Rosalie said. I am, he rode out. She watched him go. Then she went inside the barn and stood in front of the gate and looked at it. All of it, the arch and the horse and the valley panels and the chain main and the plow iron base, and she felt the deadline like a physical pressure in her chest. And she breathed through it, and she picked up her hammer. Caleb came back that afternoon and found her already at the forge and said, before he took off his jacket, Bell came by? This morning I saw him on the road heading back to town. He hung his jacket on the post. His face had something on it I didn't like. He revised his offer, Rosalie said. Called it final, is it? Doesn't matter. She turned the iron in the fire. We're not selling. How his feelings about that develop is his own business. Caleb was quiet for a moment. He moved to the bellows. What do you need today? She said. I'm starting the chain main today. I need the fire as hot as you can get it, and steady the chain links are going to be the most difficult welding in the whole piece. He put his hands on the bellows. Tell me when now, she said. The chain main took 3 days. It was the hardest work in the project. Each link had to be opened. reshaped and re-welded to the next in a sequence that followed the actual movement of a horse's mane in motion, which meant no two links could be at the same angle, which meant every single weld was different from the one before it. On the second day, she burned through 2 links entirely and had to go back to the scrap pile for replacements. And she stood over the ruined iron with her jaw tight and her hands burning, and Caleb watching her from the bellows without speaking. "Don't say anything," she said. "I wasn't going to," he said. She looked at him. He meant it. There was nothing in his face except attention. The specific, focused attention of a man waiting for the next instruction. She went back to the scrap pile. She found 2 horseshoes with the right curve. She straightened them into links. She re-welded them into the sequence. By the 3rd evening, the mane was complete, and it moved the way a mane moved. The chain caught mid-flow, the links following one another in a rhythm that was almost musical when the firelight caught them. Rosalie stood back and looked at it. "Lord," Caleb said quietly, from somewhere behind her. "Yes," she said. 2 weeks to the deadline." Jonas Pike arrived on a Thursday. She hadn't expected him. He knocked on the barn door in the mid-morning, and when she opened it, he stepped inside without waiting to be invited and stood in front of the gate with his arms crossed and his jaw working slowly the way it worked when he was thinking hard about something he hadn't decided yet. He stood there for a long time. "How close are you?" he finally asked. 10-12 days, she said. "The valley panels are done. The arch is done, the horse is done, the mane is done." She paused. "The Mercer ironwork sign across the top is the last piece." He nodded. "Your lettering. Clean in spacing. Good depth." He looked at the arch for another moment. "I've been smithing for 30 years, he said. "I have made good work. Some of it I'm proud of." He stopped. "I have not made anything like this." It was the most Jonas Pike had ever said to her in one stretch, and she understood the weight of it and did not diminish it by answering too quickly. "My grandfather would have made something like it," she said finally. "Walt would have," Jonas agreed, "and he would have been glad you got there instead." He turned to look at her directly. "The town doesn't know what's in this barn, Rosalie." When those doors open, he stopped. Started again. "Be ready for it to change things. That's the plan," she said. He grunted. He looked at the gate one more time. Then he left. She turned back to the forge. The sign came to her in the middle of the night. 11 days before the deadline, not as inspiration, but as a problem she had been working around without solving. She had planned a simple nameplate: Mercer Ironworks, Dry Creek. Clean letters, good placement, honest craftsmanship. She lay awake at midnight, thinking about Eleanor Fontaine's face when she had said, "I want people to know this establishment is permanent. That it was built to last." She got up. She went to the barn. She stood in front of the gate in the dark with the banked fire, casting just enough light to see the horse, the arch, the valley, and she thought about every horseshoe she had pulled from Jonas Pike's scrap pile. Every piece of bent wagon iron, every cracked bracket, every strip of plow iron someone had decided had done everything it was ever going to do. She thought about the 2 men outside the feed store. She thought about Frank Hurley's half-second pause. She thought about Belle's voice, "You think horseshoes are going to save a ranch." She thought about her grandfather standing behind her, with his arms framing hers. 12 years old, telling her not to fight the iron. She lit the fire. She worked through the night on the sign. And what she made was not the simple nameplate she had planned. The letters were large and clean and even, the spacing exact, the depth confident. But around them, around Mercer Ironworks Dry Creek, she forged a border from the smallest horseshoe fragments. The pieces too small for anything else. The bits that were left after every other piece of the gate was complete. The absolute last of what everyone else had thrown away. Nothing wasted, every piece accounted for, every discarded thing given a place. She finished the sign as the first light came through the barn boards, and she held it up and looked at it, and her arms were shaking with exhaustion, and her hands were blistered in 3 new places, and she was crying, which she discovered only because she could feel it, rather than because she had decided to. The kind of crying that had nothing weak in it. The kind that meant you had done something real. She set the sign down. She sat on the floor. Caleb knocked an hour later and found her there. The sign beside her, the gate complete above her. He stood in the doorway and took it all in her. The sign, the finished gate, and then he came and sat down on the floor across from her. His back against the bench, his hat in his hands. Neither of them said anything for a while. Then Caleb said quietly, "It's done," she said. He looked at the gate, at the horse, at the mane, at the valley panels, at the sign, which he picked up carefully and read. And she watched something move across his face, not surprise, because he had seen it being built, but a kind of settled recognition, like a man seeing proof of something he had suspected was true. He set the sign down gently. They laughed, he said, because they saw what the iron used to be. She looked at the finished horse, at the horseshoes that had built its body, the bent wagon iron of the mountains, the chain that was its mane, the discarded plow base, every piece of it taken from someone's idea of finished and made into something that was going to stand for 50 years. "So did I," she said, for a while. Caleb looked at her across the floor of the barn. "Not anymore." She met his eyes. She did not look away. "No," she said, "not anymore." Outside, Dry Creek was waking up. Wagons on the road. The sound of the town beginning its ordinary day, with no knowledge of what was in the Mercer barn. No idea that 11 days from now those doors were going to open, and every assumption they had been carrying about the widow's daughter and her pile of rusted horseshoes was going to have to be rebuilt from the ground up. Rosalie stood up. She picked up her apron. She tied it. $206 in the jar. 11 days. $420 owed. And a gate that was going to change everything if she could turn what was in this barn into what was in her ledger before the deadline arrived. She looked at Caleb. "I need to start making appointments," she said. He got to his feet. "Then let's start making appointments," he said. She opened the barn door. The light came in. The appointments started the same day the barn doors opened to the light. Rosalie had not planned a formal announcement. She had not printed notices or sent word through Tom Greer's store or asked anyone to spread the news. What she had done was tell Caleb, and Caleb had mentioned it to Aldous Webb when he came to collect his finished brackets. And Webb had told 2 men at the feed store, and those 2 men had told their wives. And by the following morning, 3 people had already driven past the Mercer property on the East Road and slowed their wagons to look at the gate standing at the property entrance. She had installed it at dawn, before the heat came up, with Caleb on one side and Abigail on the other, and Jonas Pike standing back with his arms crossed and his jaw working the way it did when he was trying not to show that something had affected him. The gate went up in one piece. When it was fully upright and the arch caught the early light, and the horse forward through the center, and the Mercer Iron Works Dry Creek sign settled into its position across the top. Jonas Pike said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "Level." It was the highest compliment available from Jonas Pike. And everyone present understood that. By mid-morning, 4 wagons had stopped on the road. By noon, 2 of the drivers had knocked on the barn door. Rosalie answered both of them, the same way she brought them inside. Showed them the remaining pieces on the bench, opened her ledger, and quoted prices. She did not perform. She did not explain herself. She let the work speak, and she let the numbers stand without apology. And both men placed orders before they left. She wrote their names in the ledger. The jar on the kitchen counter had $231 in it by evening. 189 to go. 10 days. She lay awake that night doing the arithmetic, the way she had done it every night for 3 months. Except that now the shape of it was different, not a wall. Not an impossible distance, but a specific gap with a specific path across it. She had Webb's balance due on delivery. She had Garrett's household pieces ready to deliver. She had Rourke's 2 pasture gates half-built. She had 3 new orders from the road. She had the Fontaine deposit already counted. She had Pike's overflow repair money from 2 jobs she'd completed last week. She added them up. She added them up again. She set down her pencil and stared at the ceiling. It was enough. Barely, exactly, with no margin for error and no room for anything to go wrong. It was enough. She got up. She went to the barn. She worked until 3 in the morning because the margin was too thin to waste a single night on sleep. The crisis she hadn't planned for arrived on a Tuesday. Garrett came to the ranch in the morning with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that Rosalie recognized before he said a word, the look of a man carrying bad news he wishes he didn't have to deliver. "My wife's commission," he said. Rosalie went still. "What about it?" "I need to delay payment." He couldn't meet her eyes. "Lost 2 head of cattle last week to a fence break. Had to replace fencing on the north pasture. The cash I'd set aside," he stopped. "Clara would have my hide if she knew I was here telling you this. But I can't pay you what I owe you this week. Maybe next week. Maybe the week after. The week after the deadline." Rosalie calculated. If Garrett's payment slipped past the deadline, she was short. Not by much, but by enough. Enough to give Belle exactly the opening he'd been patient all summer waiting for. She breathed in once, slowly. "The pieces are finished," she said. "I know. Clara's been asking about them every day. I'll deliver them Thursday," Rosalie said. Garrett looked up. "But I just told you I'll deliver them Thursday," she repeated. "Your wife commissioned something. That means something to her family. That doesn't change because your fence broke." She looked at him steadily. "You can pay me when you can. I'll trust you." Garrett stared at her. Something moved across his face, not relief exactly, but the more complicated feeling of a man who has been treated better than he expected to be and doesn't quite know what to do with it. "Miss Mercer," he said. "That's business," she said. "Good neighbors make good business. And Dry Creek is not so big that I can afford to let a good customer feel like he failed me." He left. She stood in the barn alone for a moment and did the arithmetic again, and the arithmetic was worse, and she looked at the wall where her grandfather's tools hung, and she said out loud, "To the empty barn, I know. Don't fight it." She went back to work. Caleb arrived at noon, and she told him about Garrett without softening it. Because Caleb was the kind of man who was more useful with accurate information than with managed information. He listened without interrupting. Then he said, "How short does that put you?" She told him the number. He was quiet for a moment. Then Webb's balance due on delivery. "He's taking delivery most of it." "Most isn't all." "No," he agreed. He turned his hat in his hands once. "Eleanor Fontaine." Rosalie shook her head. "I already took her deposit. I can't ask for more before I've done the work." "She offered you the deposit because she values the relationship," Caleb said. "A woman like Eleanor Fontaine understands cash flow." "It wouldn't—" "No," Rosalie said. He stopped. "I didn't build this by asking people to carry me," she said. "I'm not starting now." Caleb held her gaze. He didn't argue. He nodded, once the nod of a man who disagrees with a decision and intends to respect it anyway. "Then what?" he said. Rosalie looked at the ledger. "I have 3 road orders. If 2 of them can take delivery before the deadline and pay on the spot. You need them," says. "I need to go ask them." She took off her apron and hung it on the post. She went to hitch the wagon. Caleb said, "I'll come." She looked at him. "Not to speak for you," he said quickly. "Just 2 people arriving is more serious than 1. It tells them this matters." She thought about it for exactly 4 seconds. "All right," she said, "but you don't say a word about the money." "Understood." They drove to the first road order to gather a rancher named Pullman, who had commissioned a set of 6 cattle gate brackets after stopping his wagon in front of the Mercer Arch for nearly 5 minutes. Pullman was at home, and he came to the door with his sleeves rolled up and the look of a man who had been interrupted mid-task and was calculating whether the interruption was worth it. Rosalie explained that the brackets were ready ahead of schedule. She asked if he could take delivery that day and settle payment now rather than at week's end. Pullman looked at her, looked at Caleb standing 2 steps back with his hat in his hands. Silent looked back at Rosalie. He said, "If it works for you," she said. "If not, end of week is fine. Today works," he said. "Saves me a trip." He went inside and came back with the money, and Rosalie counted it, noted it in the ledger, and thanked him. Back in the wagon. Caleb said 1, 2 to go, she said, and pushed the horse into a trot. The second rancher, a man named Haskell, was not home. His wife was. She was a tall, direct woman named Frances who came to the door and listened to Rosalie's explanation without expression and then said, "The brackets are finished?" "Yes, ma'am. And they look like what you're building at the end of your road." "Smaller," Rosalie said. "But the same quality." Frances Haskell looked at her for a long moment. "My husband will be back by 4 o'clock. Can you bring them then?" "I can. We'll pay on delivery," Frances said. And she paused. "I want to commission something else. When you have time. I saw your gate last week and I couldn't stop thinking about it." She paused again. And something softened at the edge of her expression. "I grew up watching my mother get told her work wasn't worth as much as a man's equivalent. I just wanted you to know I see what you're doing out there. And I think it's fine work." Rosalie held Frances Haskell's gaze and felt something she had not expected to feel in the middle of a collection, run the specific, clarifying warmth of being recognized by someone who understood what it cost. "Thank you," she said. "I'll be back at 4. They delivered to Haskell at 4 o'clock and collected payment and drove back to the ranch in the early evening. And Rosalie sat on the wagon seat with the money in her pocket and the ledger in her lap and added the numbers while the horse found his own way home on the familiar road. She put her pencil down. She picked it up. She added again. "Caleb," she said. "Yeah, I'm short $14. Silence. 14, he said. $14 and some cents. She stared at the numbers. Webb's balance covers the bulk of it. The road orders cover most of the rest. Garrett's late payment leaves a gap." She paused. $14. Caleb said nothing for a moment. The wagon rolled. The horse's hooves marked out a steady rhythm on the packed dirt road. "How many repair jobs does Pike owe you for?" he said. She thought. 2. He hasn't settled for last week's work yet. "Do you know what he's paying you?" She told him. Caleb was quiet again. Then he said, "That's $18. She stopped breathing for exactly 1 second. She had forgotten. She had been so focused on the commission gap that she had left Jonas Pike's repair settlement completely out of her arithmetic because she had mentally filed it as next week's money and stopped looking at it. $18. She put the pencil back in her pocket. She sat very still on the wagon seat for a moment. "If Pike settles before the deadline," Caleb said carefully. "He will," she said. "He's Jonas Pike. He doesn't owe anybody money for longer than it takes him to get to his cash box," Caleb said. "Then you have it," she breathed out. "I have it," she said. The wagon rolled on toward home, and Rosalie Mercer sat with the ledger on her knees and the evening air on her face in the specific, exhausted, terrified, real feeling of a thing that was actually going to work pressing against the inside of her chest like a second heartbeat. She didn't say anything else. Neither did he. Sometimes the right moment was too large for words, and you just had to let it be what it was. The morning of the deadline, Horace Bell arrived at 8 o'clock. He came in his good buggy behind his well-fed horse. Dressed well, unhurried, arranged. He came looking like a man who expected to conduct business, which meant he had not heard about the gate, or had heard about it, and had not adjusted his assessment of the situation, which amounted to the same thing. He pulled into the yard and stopped. He looked at the road. He looked at the entrance to the Mercer property. He looked at the arch, at the horse, at the valley panels, at the Mercer Ironworks Dry Creek sign across the top, catching the morning light, every letter clean and even and exactly right. He sat in his buggy and looked at it for a long moment. Then he climbed down. Rosalie was already standing in the yard. She had been there since 7, because she had known what time he would come, the same way you know what time weather arrives, when you've been watching it build all summer. Abigail was on the porch. Caleb was standing to Rosalie's left. 2 steps back, his hat in his hands. Bell walked toward Rosalie with his eyes moving between the gate and her face. Recalibrating as he came. "Miss Mercer," he said. Bell, he looked at the gate one more time. "I underestimated you," he said. And it was possibly the most honest thing she had ever heard him say, delivered in the same pleasant, controlled tone as everything else, which meant she could not fully trust the honesty of it. But she acknowledged it anyway. "People often do," she said. He looked at her. "Nevertheless, the debt is due today. Whatever you've built," he gestured toward the gate, "is impressive. But impressive doesn't settle a note." "No, sir," Rosalie said. "It doesn't." She reached into her apron pocket and produced the ledger. "Webb's balance paid Friday on delivery," she said. She set a folded paper on the fence post beside her, the delivery receipt with payment noted. "Rourke's 2 pasture gates paid Thursday," another paper. "Pullman's brackets paid Tuesday. Haskell's brackets paid Tuesday. 2 more. Pike's repair settlement paid yesterday morning," another. "Fontaine deposit signed and paid 3 weeks ago," another. "Road commissions paid on delivery last week." She set the last papers down. Bell looked at the row of receipts on the fence post. He did not move. "And the balance in the kitchen jar," Rosalie said, "represents accumulated sales over the course of this summer. Trivets, hooks, tack hardware, gate brackets, household iron, and 1 garden gate repair." She reached into her other pocket and produced an envelope. "Combined total." She set the envelope on the fence post beside the receipts. Bell picked it up. He opened it. He counted. The yard was absolutely silent. Abigail on the porch. Caleb 2 Pike, who had arrived at 7:30 without explanation and was standing near the barn with his arms crossed, saying nothing. Bell counted the money a second time. He looked up. $422, he said. $422.16, Rosalie said. I wanted to be precise. Something moved across Bell's face, not the pleasant mask this time, not the careful calibration, but something underneath all of that. Something she couldn't entirely read because it was too many things at once. Surprise was in it, and something that was almost respect, reluctant and unwilling but present, and underneath both of those, very faint, the look of a man who has lost a game he expected to win and is deciding how to carry it. He folded the money back into the envelope. He set it down. The debt is settled, he said. Yes, sir. He picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the buggy seat. He looked at the gate one final time, the horse, the arch, the sign, all of it assembled from the iron his allies had thrown into scrap piles, and his townspeople had laughed at a woman for collecting. That gate, he said. What's it worth? It's not for sale, Rosalie said. He nodded slowly. He put his hat on. I'll be watching your business, Miss Mercer. I expect you will, she said. He climbed into the buggy and drove away. Nobody spoke until the sound of the wheels faded on the road. Then Abigail came off the porch, walked past Rosalie, picked up the envelope from the fence post, and went inside. Through the open door, Rosalie could hear her mother's footsteps cross the kitchen and the sound of the set jar being set and the specific quiet of a woman sitting down because her legs finally decided they'd had enough of standing. Jonas Pike uncrossed his arms. He looked at the gate. He looked at Rosalie. He said, well. Then he walked to his wagon and drove back toward town. Caleb stepped up beside her. They stood together, looking at the empty road where Bell's buggy had been. You did it, he said. She said. He shook his head. No, I worked the bellows. You built the paused. There's a difference, and I think you know it. She looked at him. He was looking at the gate, not at her, with the particular expression of a man who has witnessed something he intends to remember for a long time. Caleb, she said. She held out her hand. He looked at it for a moment. Then he shook it, the real handshake. The kind that meant something, and he held it a moment longer than strictly necessary. And she let him. "Come to supper," she said. "Mama's going to cook something good tonight." She always does when she's relieved. The corner of his mouth moved. "Is that an invitation?" "It's a fact and an invitation," she said. Both at once. Then he said, "I'll be there." She let go of his hand. She turned and walked back toward the barn, because there were 3 new orders in the ledger, and the Fontaine commissions still to build, and the forge was going to need tending. And the work was not finished. The work was never finished. That was the thing about building something real. It kept going. It kept asking more of you, and she had learned this summer that the asking was not a burden. It was the point. She pulled open the barn door. The fire in the forge had burned low while she was in the yard. But the coals were still orange underneath, still holding heat. Still ready. She picked up a horseshoe from the pile. She put it in the fire. Clang. Outside on the road to Dry Creek, 3 wagons had already slowed to look at the Mercer arch. One had stopped completely. A man was climbing down from the seat to get a better look at the horse. At the chainmain, at the valley panels, at the name across the top. Inside the barn, Rosalie Mercer worked, and the sound of her hammer carried out across the valley, the way it had carried every evening all summer. Steady and deliberate and unhurried, the sound of someone who knew exactly what she was doing and intended to keep doing it for a very long time. The supper that night was the best meal Abigail Mercer had cooked in 4 years. She didn't say that. She didn't need to. It was evident in the way she moved around the kitchen with something lighter in her shoulders. The specific relief of a woman who had been bracing for impact for so long that the absence of impact felt like its own kind of arrival. She made biscuits and roasted chicken and a corn pudding that Rosalie hadn't tasted since the summer before her father died. And she set the table with the good plates, which she only did when something had happened that deserved the good plates. Caleb ate 2 helpings of everything and complimented the corn pudding specifically. And Abigail looked at him with the expression she reserved for people who notice the right things, which was the closest she came to open approval on short acquaintance. "You worked hard this summer," Abigail said to him. Over the table. "I worked the bellows," Caleb said. "Your daughter did the hard part." "The bellows matter," Abigail said. "A fire without air is just heat going nowhere." Caleb looked at Rosalie across the table. Rosalie looked at her plate because she needed to for a moment. After supper, Caleb helped clear without being asked, which Abigail also noticed, and then he said goodnight and put on his hat, and Rosalie walked him out to the yard where his horse was tied. The night was warm, and the stars were thick, and the Mercer arch stood at the end of the property road, catching the moonlight. The horse mid-motion, the sign clear above it. Caleb looked at it for a moment. "It looks different at night," he said. "Everything does," she said. He untied his horse. He didn't mount immediately. He stood with the reins in his hands and looked at the gate, and then at her with the expression of a man who has something to say and is choosing the right words carefully rather than the fast ones. "I want to say something," he said. "All right, I've known a lot of capable people," he said. Men who built things. Men who made things work when they shouldn't have. I respect that kind of person." He paused. "What you did this summer is different from all of that. Not because of the gate, though. The gate is extraordinary. But because of how you did it. You didn't bend once. Not to Belle, not to the money, not to any of them." He paused again. "I want you to know I saw that, all of it." Rosalie looked at him steadily. "Why does it matter that you saw it?" He met her eyes. "Because I want you to know that the way I see you has nothing to do with what everyone else decided before they ever gave you a chance. And I want to make sure you know the difference." She was quiet for a moment. "I know the difference," she said. "Good." He swung up onto his horse. He settled in the saddle and looked down at her. "I'll be by Thursday with the deposit for the east pasture gate. I'll have the measurements ready," she said. "And Rosalie," he paused, reins easy in his hands, looking down at her in the moonlight. I'm glad I knocked on your barn door. She tilted her head slightly. You're glad I made you a better bracket. I'm glad you made me a better bracket, he agreed. And everything that came after it, he wrote out. She stood in the yard listening to his horse fade down the road. And she let herself feel all of it, all the complicated, layered, terrifying warmth of it for exactly as long as it took the sound to disappear. Then she went inside and washed the good plates and went to bed. And for the first time in 3 months, she slept without doing arithmetic. The change in Dry Creek came the way all real change comes, not in a single dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of smaller ones, each individually unremarkable, together amounting to something that could not be undone. It started with the gate, 3 days after the debt was settled. A cattle dealer passing through from Denver stopped his wagon in front of the Mercer arch for so long that the man behind him had to call out to ask if something was wrong. The dealer climbed down and walked the full length of the gate and then walked back and stood in front of the horse and looked at it with the focused attention of a man calculating the value of a thing he had not expected to encounter. He knocked on the barn door. Rosalie answered. Who built this? He said. I did. He looked at her. He did the inventory, the size, the dress, the leather apron, the iron dust on her hands, and she watched him process the gap between what he'd expected and what was standing in front of him. Then he said, I have a ranch outside of Denver. New construction. I want an entrance gate. What? She said. He described it. She opened her ledger. The commission he placed was the largest single order she had ever written. And when he drove away, she stood in the barn doorway and looked at the number in her ledger and understood that something had shifted, not just in her circumstances, but in the nature of what Mercer Ironworks was going to be. She went inside and told Abigail. Abigail sat down at the kitchen table. Denver, she said. Outside Denver, Rosalie said. But yes. Abigail pressed her hands flat on the table. She looked at them. Then she looked at Rosalie. Your grandfather used to say that good work found its own way to people who needed it, she said. I thought that was the kind of thing old men said because it sounded better than the truth. What's the truth? Rosalie asked. That most of the time good work goes unnoticed because the wrong people are doing the looking. Abigail paused. But sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes the right person comes down the right road at the right moment and they see it. She paused again. Your grandfather would have said he was right. I think I'd have to let him. Rosalie sat down across from her. They looked at each other across the kitchen table. Mama, Rosalie said, we're going to need to expand the barn. Abigail blinked. Then she laughed, actually laughed, short and real and surprised out of her, and it was the best sound Rosalie had heard all summer. The sign went up on the second week of September. Old Iron bought or traded here. Jonas Pike came and looked at it from the road and said nothing, which from Jonas Pike meant he approved. Then he came in and sat down on the stool near the bench and said, Hendricks has a broken wheel hub that needs a collar weld. His boy brought it in this morning. My hands aren't reliable enough for the fit tolerance. Leave it on the bench, Rosalie said, without looking up from the piece she was working. He left it on the bench. He sat there for a while longer, watching her work the way he never used to watch her work, with the specific attention of a man who was studying something rather than judging it. And eventually he said, You're holding the hammer wrong for that angle. She stopped. She looked at her grip. She adjusted it. She struck the piece. It was better. Thank you, she said. He grunted. Your grandfather held it wrong too. Ran in families, apparently. He stood up. I'll send Hendricks's collar over tomorrow. I'll have it by Thursday, she said. He left. She looked at the piece in her hands and thought about her grandfather and his flat, patient voice and the specific feeling of being taught something by someone who thought you were worth the trouble. And she felt his absence the way she had felt it for 11 years, not as a wound anymore, but as a shape. A specific space in her life that had been his and was now hers to fill differently. She put the piece back in the fire. The women of Dry Creek came in a different sequence than the men. And they came for different reasons. And what they found when they arrived was different from what they had expected. Clara Garrett came first, as she often did, ahead of most trends in Dry Creek. Ahead of most opinions. She brought 2 women from her church circle. And they stood in the barn, looking at the pieces on the bench, and asking questions that were specific and intelligent, and had nothing pitying in them. Clara's wall piece had been delivered 3 weeks ago, and was already a topic of conversation at church, which Clara reported with the particular satisfaction of a woman who had gotten somewhere first, and was generously willing to tell others the route. She asked about what the family meant to you, Clara told the other women, explaining how the commission had worked. She didn't just make me something. She made me something that was actually mine. One of the women looked at Rosalie. Could you do that for me too? Tell me about your family, Rosalie said. And I'll tell you what I can make. They stayed for 2 hours. They each left with a commission. Frances Haskell came the following week and brought her sister from 2 counties over, who was getting married in the spring and wanted something iron for the new home because her grandmother had always said iron in a house meant the family would hold. Rosalie listened to the story about the grandmother. She asked 3 questions. She made a sketch on the back of an old receipt, and Frances's sister looked at the sketch and said yes. Immediately, before Rosalie had finished explaining it. Margaret Holt came on a Thursday afternoon and sat on the stool Jonas Pike had claimed as his own and looked at Rosalie with the direct eyes of a woman who had made a decision and was here to execute it. I want to commission something for my husband's grave marker, she said. Without preamble. Iron. Something that lasts. Something that looks like him. Rosalie set down her hammer. She looked at Margaret. Tell me what he was like, she said. Margaret talked for 40 minutes. She talked about a man who had loved horses and hated waste and made the best joke she had ever heard on the day they first met and never quite matched it afterward, and she had loved him for 31 years, and she missed him. Every single morning when she made coffee for one. When she finished, Rosalie said, I know what I'm going to make. Margaret looked at her. What? Come back in 3 weeks, Rosalie said. And you'll see. Margaret left. Rosalie sat in the barn for a moment with the weight of that particular commission settled on her shoulders, not a burden but a responsibility. The kind you were glad to carry, because being trusted with it meant something. Then she picked up her hammer. That was when Horace Bell came back. He came on a Tuesday in October, and he came differently than before, not in the good buggy. Not with the arranged pleasantness, but on foot, having tied his horse at the road, which meant he had stopped and looked at the gate before he came in. He knocked on the barn door properly this time. He waited for her to answer. She opened it. He stood with his hat in his hands. She had never seen Horace Bell with his hat in his hands. Miss Mercer, he said, do you have a minute? She stepped back. He came inside. He looked around the barn, the organized bench, the sorted scrap, the pieces in progress, the ledger open on the side table, and he took it all in with the eyes of a man doing genuine assessment rather than the calibrated performance of one. I've been thinking, he said. About what? About the fact that I spent 6 months trying to acquire a property that what was sitting on top of something I completely failed to identify. He paused. That's a business error. I don't make many of them, and I prefer to learn from the ones I do make. Rosalie looked at him steadily. What exactly are you saying, Mr. Bell? I'm saying I was wrong about your situation, he said. I saw a widow and a debt, and I thought I understood what that meant. I didn't. He paused. I also want to say, and this is such a... So I'll say it plainly, I was wrong about you. Specifically. About what you were capable of and what you were worth. He looked at her directly. I'd like to commission a gate. The barn was very quiet. For which property, she said. He named the address his own. The Bell property, the largest ranch in the county. The one with the stone pillars at the entrance and the long road lined with cottonwoods. What you charge other people, he said before she could speak. Not more. I'm not buying my way back into your good opinion. I'm asking for work that's worth what I'm paying. Rosalie looked at him for a long moment. I'm booked through spring, she said. I can wait until summer, he said. She picked up her ledger. She opened it to the forward commission pages, the ones she had started keeping when the Denver order came in. The ones that now ran 4 pages deep with names she hadn't imagined writing 2 months ago. She wrote Horace Bell's name. She wrote summer next to it. She looked up. I'll need a deposit when we discuss specifications. Name the amount, he said. She named it. He produced it from his coat without hesitation, counted it out on the bench in exact bills, and picked up his hat. Thank you, he said. And he meant it. She could hear it. The specific register of a man saying a thing he doesn't say easily. Mr. Bell, she said as he turned to go. He looked back. The iron I'll use for your gate, she said. I'll buy it from whoever in the county has old scrap to sell. Broken shoes, bent brackets, whatever they've been throwing away. She paused. I always do. He held her gaze for a moment. Then something moved across his face that was neither the pleasant mask nor the hard thing underneath it, but something more honest than either. Good, he said. He left. She stood in the barn alone and looked at his name in the ledger and felt, of all things, something that was not triumph. Triumph was too simple for what this was. It was more like completion, the specific feeling of a circle drawn closed. Not dramatically, not with fanfare, but with the quiet satisfaction of a line that had found its way back to where it started. She went back to work. Caleb came by on a Thursday with a horseshoe. Just one. Old, rusted, bent at one edge, the kind of thing she found in scrap piles every week. He set it on her bench without explanation and stood back with his hat in his hands and looked at her with the expression she had come to know over the course of a summer, the one that meant he had something to say and was deciding how to say it honestly rather than strategically. She picked up the horseshoe. She turned it over. It was badly oxidized. The nail holes clogged, the curve slightly off from wear. Nothing about it was remarkable. It was exactly the kind of iron the whole town had been throwing away all summer. Something broken, she said. No, he said. I just figured you'd know what it could become. She looked up. He was watching her the way he watched her work seriously. With complete attention, the way you watched something you weren't willing to miss. Caleb, she said. I'm aware. You rode 3 miles to bring me a horseshoe you found somewhere. I did. She looked at him. He looked back. The fire in the forge was warm between them, and the barn smelled of iron and coal and something that had been building all summer in the particular space that existed between two people who had been honest with each other through hard things. It'll make a good hook, she said. I thought it might, he said. Or I could make it into something else, she said. Depending on what you need. What would you suggest, he said. She set the horseshoe down on the bench, very carefully. Precisely, the way you set down something you intend to come back to. Come to supper Sunday, she said, and tell me what you're actually here to say. Because I'd rather hear it over a real meal than over an anvil. He looked at her for a moment. Then the corner of his mouth moved, not the precursor to a smile this time, but the actual thing, complete, unhurried, the smile of a man who has arrived somewhere he intended to be. Sunday, he said. Sunday, she said. He left the horseshoe on the bench. She let him. The town of Dry Creek did not change overnight. Towns didn't. People who had laughed at the widow's heavy daughter hauling rusted iron through the street did not. In the main, wake up the following morning and understand what they had done. Understanding of that kind came slowly, if it came at all. And it came through the accumulation of evidence rather than through a single confrontation that shamed it into existence. What changed was the evidence. The gate at the Mercer property became a landmark. People gave directions using it. Strangers stopped on the road because they had heard about it from someone who had stopped on the road. The cattle dealer from Denver told 2 colleagues, and one of them wrote a letter to Rosalie in November with a commission inquiry. and the letter was addressed to Mercer Iron Works, Dry Creek, Colorado, which meant that name had traveled far enough to be used by someone who had never stood in front of the arch, or knocked on the barn door, or seen Rosalie Mercer in person. The name had traveled. The work had gone ahead of her and introduced her without asking her permission, which was exactly what she had needed it to do. Denton, the cattle hand, who had made the loudest jokes outside the feed store, came to the barn in November with a broken harness ring and stood in the doorway with the particular posture of a man who needed something and was not comfortable about the needing. "Heard you take repair work," he said. "I do," Rosalie said. He held out the ring. She took it. She examined it. She named a price and a time frame. He agreed to both. He did not apologize. She did not ask him to. What happened instead was that he came back when the ring was ready, paid the exact amount, and said, "Good work." 2 words. Flat and plain, not elaborate, not performative, just accurate. It was enough. She watched him leave and thought about the 3 seconds she had developed the habit of taking. The 3 seconds between the impact of something and the response to it. And she understood that those 3 seconds had not been weakness. They had been the choice to keep her hands moving when every natural impulse said stop. They had been the practice of staying in motion when the world was trying to make her stand still. She had stayed in motion, and here was what motion had built. Jonas Pike came to the barn on the first Friday of December with his coat on against the cold and a look on his face that was as close to ceremonial as Jonas Pike got. He sat on his stool. He set his hat on the bench. He looked at Rosalie for a moment in a way that meant he had been thinking about something for a while and had come to say it. "Your grandfather asked me once," he said, "what I thought the hardest thing about smithing was. I told him it was the fire management. Getting the temperature right. Keeping it consistent." He paused. "Walt said I was wrong. He said the hardest thing was knowing what a piece of iron was capable of before you could see the evidence of it. Believing in the potential before the work proved it." He looked at the gate plans rolled out on the bench, the Denver Commission, the Bell Commission, the spring backlog. He was right, Jonas said. He usually was. Rosalie looked at him. "He would have liked watching you figure that out," Jonas said. "That's all." He put his hat back on. He picked up the repair list she'd left for him his 2 days a week in the shop. His aging hands still good for finish work and simpler welds, and he went to the bench and put on his apron without another word. She went back to her fire. They worked side by side in the warm barn while December pressed cold against the walls. And the forge between them kept the whole space bright. And the sound of 2 people working iron filled the afternoon the way it had filled this barn in Walt Mercer's time. The hammer and the bellows, and the particular sense of people who understood each other without needing to say so. Spring came early that year. By March, Rosalie had fulfilled the Denver Commission. Delivered Margaret Holt's grave marker, which Margaret had cried over, and then composed herself and said it was exactly right. He would have hated fuss and completed 4 of the 7 gates on the forward commission list. The barn addition was framed and would be ready by summer. She had hired a local boy named Edmund to handle material moving and general labor 3 days a week. And Edmund had shown an unexpected interest in the forge itself. Asking careful questions when she worked, watching her hands with the particular attention she recognized, because she had worn it herself at 12 years old standing beside her grandfather. One afternoon in late March she set a horseshoe in his hands. "Feel the weight of it," she said. He held it. "Now tell me what it could be," she said. He frowned at the horseshoe. He turned it. He looked at the curve and the nail holes in the worn edge. "A hook?" he said. "Maybe," she said. "What else?" he thought. "Part of something bigger?" "Always," she said. "Now put it in the fire and we'll find out which one." He put it in the fire. She stood beside him the way her grandfather had still eyed her, not performing patience but actually having it. The real kind, the kind that came from understanding that the learning could not be rushed without ruining the thing being learned. Walt Mercer had taught her that. She intended to pass it on. Caleb came to supper every Sunday. It was not announced as a formal arrangement, and it was not called anything in particular. But it happened every week with the regularity of something that had found its natural place. And Abigail set 3 plates now, without comment, and Caleb brought something each time, once a bottle of good wine he'd ordered, specially. Once a jar of honey from a neighbor's hive, once, memorably, a horseshoe he'd found in his east pasture, rusted and bent, which he set in the center of the table with a completely straight face. Rosalie looked at it. She looked at him. Again, she said. "I keep finding them," he said. "No, you don't," she said. He smiled. "No," he said. Abigail looked between them and picked up her fork and said, "I made corn pudding, as if none of this was happening." Which was exactly the right thing to say. One evening in April, after supper, Rosalie and Caleb stood at the barn door, the way they sometimes stood when the evening was worth standing in. And Caleb said quietly, looking at the arch at the end of the property road, "You never told me what made you certain it would work. The gate, the ironworks, all of it. What made you certain?" She thought about it honestly. "I wasn't certain," she said. "I was angry. And I had my grandfather's tools and a pile of iron everyone else had thrown away." She paused. "Certain is a luxury. I didn't have room for it. But you never stopped," he said. "No, I." She looked at the gate, at the horse, at the horseshoes that had built its body, each one a thing someone had decided was finished, was worthless, was past the point of being useful to anyone. "Because the alternative was letting them be right about me," she said. "And they weren't right. They were just looking at what I used to be before I got heated up and reshaped." She paused. "Same as the iron." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he reached out and took her hand. Not dramatically. Not with a speech. Just the simple, direct gesture of a man who had decided and was saying, so the only way that actually meant anything with his hands, which were honest, which had worked beside her all summer, which she trusted. She held it. They stood there at the barn door in the April evening with the forge warm behind them and the arch at the end of the road catching the last light, and the valley spread out around the Mercer property with its cattle and its mountains and its wagon road. And somewhere out there, a town that had laughed was now sending people down the east road to look at what the widow's daughter had made from their rusted garbage. Rosalie held Caleb's hand and looked at the gate she had built from the things everyone else had thrown away. And she understood, finally and completely, what her grandfather had been trying to tell her all those years ago, when she was 12 and stubborn and certain that iron didn't want anything. Iron wasn't worthless because it was rusted. A woman wasn't worthless because the world had decided she took up too much space. You put the right heat on a thing, you gave it the right pressure. You had the patience to wait for the moment when it was ready, and what had looked like the end of something turned out to be the beginning of something else entirely. That was the truth of it. That was what the forge had been trying to teach her since the first night she lit it. And on the east road to Dry Creek, on a piece of land that belonged to the Mercer family, and would belong to the Mercer family, the gate stood in the evening light, the Mustang breaking forward, the horseshoes forming its body, the chain lifting in its mane, the valley of Colorado iron surrounding it, and across the arch the name that the whole county knew now. The name that had traveled to Denver and back and was still traveling, Mercer Ironworks, steady and permanent and exactly level. Because Rosalie Mercer had built it to last, and she had built it from what the world had thrown away, and she was just getting started.